Welcome to Great Loop Radio, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo, the director of AGLCA. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that sparked a lot of comments and a lot of interest on our members' discussion forum recently, and that is the VHF radio and the proper way to use it and the way to use it and follow proper etiquette as well as rules. So I have asked Dave Fuller to join me again. He's been with us recently, and he is with the Coast Guard Auxiliary, but I'll let him kind of more officially introduce himself in a moment. But I do want to stop to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. So with the business finished, Dave Fuller, thank you for joining me again. Welcome back.
Good to be here, Kim.
Yeah, and for those of you, if you did not catch Dave doing this podcast on opportunities that both the Coast Guard Auxiliary and others offer for boating education, definitely check that out because it was a great session. And I've heard from several people, Dave, who have joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary subsequently to watching that. So thank you for sharing all that information. But go ahead, for anyone who maybe did not see that, go ahead and refresh us a little bit on your boating background and your current position with the Coast Guard Auxiliary.
Well, I've been boating quite a long time, as a lot of loopers have. I got involved with the Coast Guard Auxiliary back right after 9/11 and found out that maybe my background with ham radio and my background with the leadership things that I'd done in the past might come into play. And I found out that even though I got recruited as a watchstander, I found that the auxiliary does a lot of other things, a lot of really good work. And so I've been very fortunate. I've had some good mentors along the way, and I've applied some of my corporate background and was able to move up through the ranks. Currently, the hat that I'm wearing right now is the Director of Education for the auxiliary. And I think I've really found my home. It's really something I like, and know that my team is really making a difference in people's lives by making them smarter. Our goal is to keep all of the Coast Guard response guys. That's the guys that jump out of perfectly good helicopters and save people. Our job is to keep those guys in the stations playing video games. And so when we do that right, they get some time off. But enough of that for now. I've learned a few things along the way, and like to share that information, and that's what brings me to you today.
Yeah, and thank you for your service to boaters and boating education, and thank you for giving us your time, because it's great to have access to somebody with your kind of knowledge. Today we want to talk about the VHF radio because I think all of us can use a refresher sometimes, and we do have a lot of new boaters who really aren't familiar with using the VHF. Particularly some weekend boaters tend not to use it as much as long distance cruisers like loopers might. So using the VHF radio properly is, it's partly about rules and regulations. It's partly about courtesy, and it's a lot about safety. So we really want to focus on all of that. Tell us what the Coast Guard says about the VHF, who's required to have one, and what kind of true regulations as opposed to just courtesy are there surrounding the VHF radio.
Sure, Kim. Let me kind of break this into a couple of separate parts. Let's start with why we have VHF radio. It has multiple purposes, but its primary reason for being available for us as mariners, and this is according to the FCC, is safety at sea. The secondary reason is the needs of the vessel, not necessarily the captain or the crew. And this authority comes from the Communications Act of 1934, and is currently found in the Code of Federal Regulations. Those of you that look that kind of stuff up, CFR Title 47, Part 80. And it's important to understand that the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, is the authority on radio communications, not the Coast Guard. Remember that these marine VHF channels are shared radio spectrum with all users, and there's no private conversations on the radio. So radio rules for mariners kind of fall into two categories. One of them they refer to as compulsory. In other words, you're required to carry a radio, and that would include boats that carry more than 6 passengers for hire. And then the other category are the voluntary vessels, which are those that are under 65 feet that don't carry passengers. And of course, that fits most loopers. If you have a vessel over 65 feet, you must have a ship station license, and you also must carry a radio. The ship's station license, and with that, you also need what's called a restricted radio telephone operator's permit. It's required if you are a U.S. flag vessel and you're traveling outside U.S. waters, or if you communicate with another vessel outside U.S. waters. And of course, this would include Canada, the Bahamas, et cetera. And it's all due to international treaties. And you can find a lot of this stuff, and you can look it up yourself at the, I feel is a little bit challenging to navigate FCC website. Some people have a little easier time than I do with it, but anyway, you'll find it all there. So it's important to know that radio communications, according to the rules, they're prioritized. And this is the order that they're prioritized in. The higher ones take priority over the lower ones. So we start with the most important one, of course, is the one we all know is Mayday. That's the distress communications. They take precedence over all others. Then moving down the list, the next in urgency is something that we call PON. And those are urgency, messages of urgency. Safety is next on the list, and you'll hear somebody call out security, and those are safety messages. Then comes navigation, movements, and the needs of the ship. Government, of course, gets stuck in there, and then everything else kind of falls below that, which is kind of the things that we use it for most often. And, you can get in trouble if you violate some of those rules. Some of the egregious ones, I don't expect any of our listeners here to violate any of these, but the ones that the FCC has to deal with most often are interfering with distress signals, false maydays, willfully interfering with another station, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But not really an issue, I think, for loopers.
So, and thank you for all of that information. There is an article or two on the AGLCA website about the ship station license and what you'll need for loopers who perhaps are going to Canada or the Bahamas. So if you go to the information menu and then the members knowledge base, there is an article on that was contributed by some of our members and includes links and instructions on the FCC website, which is challenging to navigate. But Dave, a couple of the things that you mentioned there, as you said, most people are familiar with Mayday, but perhaps not so much with PON or even Securite. So can you give us a couple of examples of when a looper might need to use those, or even perhaps when a looper might expect to hear those coming through the radio?
Yeah, well, Securite is the one you'll probably hear most often, and that is there's something out here that's going to be in your way. Look out for it. An example might be there's a floating object or something that might be out in the way, and you would call out the location of it just to let other people know that it exists. Mm-hmm. Also, you may be coming around a blind curve. I know there's one marina that we stayed at down in Key Largo that had a very, very sharp 90-degree turn, and you really needed to announce your intent to go around that corner before you got there, because you don't want to meet another boat in that blind corner. So you would call out a Securite to let them know that I'm coming through here. If you're out there, please, give me room to get through. PON, the urgency ones, the boat's not on fire and we're not jumping in the water yet, but we have a serious issue. We maybe have some water coming in, or just to let the Coast Guard know that you've got some kind of a problem, but not a life endangering issue. The boat's not on fire and it's not going to sink right now, but I've got an issue that's creating a problem that could lead to something bigger later. So you might hear an urgency. A PON would be that sort of thing. Doesn't rise to the level of safety of life, but it is still an urgent message.
Right. Okay, so moving on to kind of monitoring the VHF while you're underway on the loop, what channel or channels, as it may be, should loopers be monitoring when they're underway on the waterways?
Well, it depends on where you are, Kim. Obviously, the one that we all need to monitor is channel 16, which is the hailing frequency that you hail other boats on. Once you make contact, you move to a working channel. But also, I'm a very strong proponent in areas where you have commercial traffic, which is a good portion of the Great Loop, that you would also monitor channel 13. And channel 13 is where most of your commercial traffic will be. So if you need to talk to any of those boats, you'll probably find them there first. Now, they are required to monitor also channel 16, channel 16, but generally they respond on 13, on 13. In some areas, high traffic, high density areas, I think New York Harbor is this way. There's a number of large harbors that you go in that sometimes they'll be using channel 9 as the alternate hailing and distress channel. If channel 16 gets pretty busy, you can do the same thing on channel 9. So, but that really depends on your location. And the big, usually it's the big harbors is where you run into that. Now, if you have a second radio or you have your radio set on scan, you can kind of establish, you monitor the pre-established working channel. If you have a group running together, if you have several boats, you may pick a channel and say, we're going to communicate back and forth on this. Now, when you get to bridges, bridge tenders usually are on channel 13, well, it's 13, except in Florida where it tends to be channel 9 in Florida, quite a number of them. I think pretty much all of them in Florida are on channel 9. One that you probably don't need to monitor, but you do need to be aware of it and you do need to be able to turn there if you need to, is the Coast Guard non-emergency channel is 22 Alpha, 22A. And what that A stands for is a USA frequency. If it's just channel 22, your radio might be on the international. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But 22 Alpha is the USA frequency that you would talk to the Coast Guard. You might call them on channel 16, and then they would switch you to channel 22 Alpha to carry on the conversation. That gets the traffic off of 16 and frees it back up. But most commercial ships are on 13, as that is the bridge-to-bridge channel everywhere. So a really good resource for you to see what all these channels on your radio are used for, the Coast Guard Nav Center, and the kind of the easy way to get there is the NavCen, navcen.uscg.gov, navcen.uscg.gov. It has a wealth of safety information and navigation information, including radio. And if you spend a little time on that website, you'll get some really good authoritative answers. So as I said before, remember that when you're in the US, you use the US channels. And when you're outside the US, you use the international channels. Now, your radios might have a switch, a button or something. Some of them, it may be a menu programming change. You'll have to look at your at the owner's manual to see what it calls for, to how to make sure you're on the right series of frequencies. Most of the frequencies are the same between international and USA, but there are a few of them where they're called duplex frequencies, where you transmit on one, you receive on another. And some of those are simplex frequencies in international, where you talk and receive on the same frequency. So again, we're kind of down in the minutia here, but make sure you're on the right series of channels.
Yeah, so just a point of clarification, if you would, for us, Dave. You mentioned kind of having the radio on scan. One of the topics in the discussion forum was to monitor, two channels, 13 and 16, possibly some others. Is that the same as setting the radio to scan, or is it different for which you're when you want to monitor a few specific channels?
It depends, Kim, on the specifics of your radio. Some radios are capable of scanning. Some radios are capable of dual watch or tri-watch. Some will just go through every single channel, and it'll stop when it gets a radio traffic that exceeds the squelch level. Some of them will only, like if you have a dual watch radio, it will monitor 16 as your primary, and then you specify what the second frequency that you want it to monitor, which is a good thing. It allows one radio to monitor multiple frequencies. But the one drawback to it that a lot of people don't understand is when a call comes in, that radio will stop on that call. And as long as there's radio transmission going, it'll stay on that channel. But most radios, as soon as that radio transmission stops, it'll start scanning again. And you may or may not catch what channel that radio transmission came on. So it's a little harder to do the dual watch or tri-watch or the scanning, because you have to pay a little bit closer attention to the radio to see what channel did the radio stop on, and where's that radio traffic coming from, which channel.
So, and some of our members were recommending having 2 radios at the helm station. Talk to us a little bit about what the advantage to that might be, and whether you personally subscribe to that theory as that's something you should do.
Very much so. I am a big proponent of having multiple radios. So, the big advantage, if you have a dinghy and you go ashore, having a handheld radio, and you leave somebody on the big boat, that still gives you communications back and forth from your shore party back to your mothership. But one of the main reasons I use 2 radios is redundancy. What do I mean by redundancy? Well, you have 2 completely independent radio systems. Your handheld radio has its own power supply, it has its own antenna, it has its own transmitter, its own receiver. So it's completely independent of your main radio. Why is that important? Well, we found out when we were on the loop and we were coming across Apalachicola Bay, and our primary radio quit. And of course, I did all the quick troubleshooting. I thought maybe a fuse came loose or a wire became unplugged or something. And I went through all the troubleshooting, couldn't fix it. So we still had a handheld radio. I could communicate, close in, and of course, going across Apalachicola Bay to Carabel was no big deal with the handheld. However, we had planned to do the Gulf crossing the very next day, and there was no way in the world I was planning on making the Gulf crossing with only a handheld VHF radio. So we managed to pick one up at one of the marinas there in Carabel, and we kind of MacGyvered it in, we made it work so we could make our crossing. And so, having that redundancy of radio capability is really important in case of a failure. And, what's the chances of it? I don't know. I don't buy lottery tickets all that often, or don't visit Vegas and play the odds there. But it does give you complete redundancy. The second most important thing is a lot of times there's a lot of chatter on the radio. You might be monitoring 16, or you might be monitoring channel 13 or whatever. And, it becomes a distraction. It actually decreases your situational awareness because you're listening to all this chatter. So wouldn't it be a neat thing if you could hand a radio to whoever else is on the boat with you, tell them to go someplace else, monitor that traffic, and if it's anything important, they come back and tell you. And otherwise, it just takes that mental load off of you, and gives you far better situational awareness. So it's got a lot of advantages, and really no disadvantages that I know of.
Yeah. And I think some groups of loopers who are traveling together and have something they need to discuss about walking through, and who's going in what order, having that second handheld can allow you to go to a different channel and have that discussion. And if it's going to be a little bit of a longer discussion, you can still be monitoring 16 on your main radio. So I've known several loopers who have used the second radio at the helm station specifically for that. So, I agree. There's very little disadvantage to having it there, and tons of advantages. Let's take a quick break and play a message from a sponsor. When we come back, I want to just kind of walk through, what is the correct and proper and courteous way to make a call on the VHF. So for folks who have never done that before, it can be a little bit intimidating because it's not a private communication. There's lots of people out there listening to you. So we'll just run through the right way to do that, and we'll be back in a moment. This is a message from Captain Scott A. Wally. Hello, fellow loopers. S.A. Wally Marine Services is new to AGLCA, however, not to boating nor the boating community. Very few people have the opportunity to experience the Great Loop. In doing so, the time may come where some guidance and/or assistance is needed. This may be in the form of either travel or technical support. My goal as a seasoned captain and AGLCA sponsor is to be there for fellow boaters, as we are all shipmates in this exciting adventure. Signed, Captain Scott A. Wally of S.A. Wally Marine Services. We're back on Great Loop Radio. My guest today is Dave Fuller. He is the current Director of Education for the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and we're thrilled to have him back with us. Today's topic is the VHF radio and the correct way and the courteous way to use that. So, Dave, if you would, kind of run through how a looper should use the radio to make a call, whether that's, to reach another vessel, to arrange for a slow pass, or whatever the reason might be. Talk about the channel and the correct verbiage to go along with that.
Okay, Kim, very well. Yeah, the first thing you have to realize is actually properly using the radio, and how do you control the microphone. Starting out with that, you basically hold the microphone at about a 45-degree angle to your mouth, a few inches away. You don't want to be eating the microphone. You want to hold it a few inches away. You press the push to talk button, wait about a half a second before you start talking. And otherwise, if you start talking before you press the push to talk button, all of that is not heard by the person on the other end. So just kind of build that habit if you can. So the proper way to hail any vessel, if you know the name of it, it's great. And I've got another thing here you can do if you don't know the name of the vessel. So let's start assuming you know the name of the vessel. So the first thing you do is you call the name of the vessel that you're wanting to talk to. You call their name 3 times and then announce yourself and what channel you're on. So as an example, I'm trying to call the boat real time. So my call would sound like this: real time, real time, real time. This is Bite Me on channel 16. And always say the name of the other vessel first, and always call it 3 times. And you say you're on channel 16. You're not on channel 16. You're on channel 16. So why do you call it out 3 times? It's very simple. It's very likely that they have other things distracting them, and they're probably not concentrating on radio calls. And they might just miss their name being called if you only call it 1 time. So by saying it 3 times allows more opportunity for them to hear and understand that you want to talk to them. And then going back to what I said earlier about having multiple channels, or a person that's monitoring multiple radios, or the radio is on dual watch, tri watch, or scan, it also keeps that transmission going a little longer, where they can glance and see what channel they're on. And then by announcing what channel you're on, that gives them confirmation I'm calling them on channel 16. So that's the best way to do it.
Okay.
Now, if you're not on AIS and can't see the name on the boat, you kind of use a similar process, calling the boat name 3 times, you identify yourself and state the channel you're on. But if you can't see the vessel's name, or it doesn't have a name, then try and do a descriptor about the type of boat and its location. So as an example, we could say large sailboat in Boca Ciega Key near channel marker 27. Large sailboat in Boca Ciega Bay near channel marker 27. Large sailboat in Boca Ciega Bay near channel marker 27. This is the Bite Me, the 42-foot trawler on your stern, calling on channel 16. So that's a way you can do it if you don't know the name of the boat.
Okay. And then what is the appropriate response if you are the one being hailed?
Well, if you don't get a response from the boat that you're calling, just kind of be patient and give it another minute or two and try it again. But if somebody is calling you, and say it's on channel 16, so your reply to them would be, bite me, this is the real time. Switch and answer on channel 72 or whatever other channel you want to use. 68, 69, 71, 72, 78, I think. I'd have to look at my list. So there's a bunch of them you can use, but you would say, bite me, this is real time, switch and answer on channel 72. And then switch over to that channel and you'd say, bite me, this is the real time, over. So and this is another place, Kim, where having a second radio already monitoring channel 72 for other traffic is really invaluable, because you want to make sure you're not butting in on somebody else's conversation that's already going on channel 72.
Right.
And if there's a party's going on there, go find an empty channel to take the conversation to it. So, remember to listen before you transmit, so you don't step on somebody's transmission. And then one other real quick thing, Kim, one of the things I highly recommend is we use what we call pro words. And the pro word, I think a lot of people have heard this, is over. So over means that I'm done talking, but I expect you to have a reply. I expect you to reply for me. When you're done with the conversation completely and you don't expect somebody to come back to you and have additional transmission, use the pro word out. So if that's when it's finished, no replies expected. And then remember to switch back to the whatever channel you've been monitoring on.
Now, the primary reason that whole communication starts on 16, because that's being monitored, and then moves to another channel, is to keep 16 free from chatter. So tell us a little bit about why that's so important, and what's likely to happen if you forget that rule. The Coast Guard is obviously monitoring what's happening on 16 and wants that to be clear. So tell us a little bit more about why that's so important.
Well, the designation of channel 16 is that of a hailing frequency. In other words, that's where everybody's going to listen, and if there's a problem, that's where the conversation starts. Once you make contact, then you need to move off of channel 16 onto whatever other working channel that you have. If you persist and carry on a conversation more than a few seconds, the Coast Guard will gently remind you to get off the channel and take it to another working channel. And it gets a little bit more, it kind of escalates from there if people ignore that. We're kind of a self-policing community, so to speak. The majority of us are. Yeah, there's a few yahoos out there, but by and large, the Marine community kind of helps itself along, and we kind of self-monitor and help remind people that 16 channel 16 is for that purpose, and keep that frequency free.
Right. And then the other thing that I think some of us don't know the details of, talk to us a little bit about the difference between the high and low power transmissions, and when it's appropriate to use each.
Okay, very good. Yeah. The low power channel, your radio is programmed, your regular installed VHF radio is programmed to go to one, or the lowest power setting, which is generally 5 watts on the full size radios. And it can be anything from 1/10 of a watt to 1/2 a watt on a handheld, but they're programmed to go to the lowest power setting when you're on channel 13. I think there's a couple other channels that happens on as well, but they're designed to go to that because channel 13 is designed as what's called a bridge to bridge channel. which not bridges in cars driving over, but bridges of ships. And they're generally designed to be used when boats are within sight of one another. And actually, if you're inside of another boat, you can communicate effectively with maybe a tenth of a watt of power. But a lot of handhelds go down to what's called 500 milliwatts, or about a half a watt. And high power on most handhelds is 5 or 6 watts. I think there's a couple of them out there, it's 7 or 8, but most of them are 5 or 6 watts. But fixed mount radios often are 5 watts on low power and 25 watts on high. So what's the difference between that? Your radio footprint gets a lot bigger at 25 watts. It could be as much as 15 to 18 miles. And at low power, it shrinks down to maybe a couple of miles. But remember that the most important factor in range is not so much the power, but your antenna. And having the antenna up high is really will give you more range, even at lower power settings. A real quick word about antennas. There's a lot of boats out there that you see that the antennas are kind of raked back at about a 45-degree angle because everybody thinks that's cool looking. And yeah, it may be cool looking, but it's not very good for communications. Antennas work best when they're completely vertically orientated. And why that is because the radio waves propagate perpendicular to the antenna. So that means if your antenna is laying vertical, what happens is half of your signal's going down into the water, the other half's going into outer space, and people probably aren't going to hear you parallel to the surface of the water. So the more vertical it becomes, the better your carry. And that applies much more highly for handheld radios because a handheld radio has generally a little small rubber duck antenna, and they're not real effective transmitters either. So they need all the help they can get. So try and remember when you're using your handheld radio, try and use it in as vertical an orientation as you can.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, any other things, tips, or otherwise that you wish loopers understood more about the VHF radio and its usage?
Well, I think, for especially boaters that are new to VHF radios, I think maybe build yourself a little cheat sheet and write out a couple of scripts to get you through the first few calls. There's some good resources out there. Boat US has a couple of really good videos on marine VHF. Another good source that I looked at their website yesterday, America's Boating Channel, part of the US Power Squadrons. They've got some good videos on VHF radios. But I would urge everybody to be kind of careful, not just any YouTube video out there maybe are not quite all authoritative. Use your best judgment. But a couple of really important things on VHF marine radios, and I'd really be remiss if I didn't add these. One of the issues, or one of the systems the Coast Guard has is it's a system called Rescue 21. And it's a really sophisticated system that tracks people that have distress, and they press that little distress button. They do have radio directional finding equipment that kind of helps them get close to where you are, figuring out your position. But what really works best is that all the radios that have been built for probably the last 10, 15 plus years have something called DSC, Digital Selective Calling. And if it has a little red button on it that says emergency or whatever the distress or whatever the nomenclature is, if that radio is connected to a GPS device, sometimes it could be a chart plotter, it could be a dedicated GPS source that feeds that location to the radio. If that's hooked up in it and they press that distress button, it sends a digitally coded message and gives the latitude, longitude, so they know exactly where you are. And the statistics that the Coast Guard has on people that have that hooked up is actually pretty dismal. There's not a lot of people that have that hooked into their the radio giving GPS location. Good news is some of the manufacturers are now starting to include that in the radios, so they don't have to have an external one. But for all that to work, you have to have something called an MMSI, which stands for Maritime Mobile Service Identity. Think about it, the equivalent to your cell phone number, and that's assigned to the radio and entered into the Coast Guard database. You can get that. I think the website has got a lot of good stuff. Where do you find that? And you can get it at the same time as your ship station license and restricted radio telephone operators permit. There's a long list of stuff. You can get it through the FCC. You can get it through Boat US, Power Squadrons. I think CTO's still doing it. I'm not sure about that, but I think the AGLCA website's got a nice long tutorial on exactly how you go through all that. But the last thing I kind of wanted to say is, you're going to learn by doing. You pick up the radio, you start talking, and before you know it, it's just second nature to you. It's not difficult. It's not hard. You'll get to be a pro at it a lot faster than you can even imagine. And then the last thing I wanted to remind everybody, another service that both the U.S. Power Squadrons and the Coast Guard Auxiliary provide is we do free annual vessel safety checks. And I would also urge anybody that hasn't already done so recently to take a basic boating safety course. The americasboatingclub.org is a good source, as the Coast Guard Auxiliary is cgaux.org or americasboatingclub.org. Those are two really good places to take boating education. And then last word is be safe and have fun. That's what we're all out here to do.
Yeah, and that's a great way to wrap it up, Dave. Thanks for providing all that information. And yes, in that last part, the MMSI number, detailed instructions for that are also in that members knowledge base under the information menu. So Dave, again, thank you for another great session. We really appreciate the information. I think you've helped a lot of people kind of wade through the pile of information down to the basics of what we need to know. So we appreciate it.
Very good.
And to everyone who has watched and listened this week, thank you for joining us once again. We'll be back next week with another episode of Great Loop Radio. Until then, safe cruising.